We are recording this session, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this program on council effectiveness. And I'm delighted all of your congregations are participating in the Stewardship for All Seasons presentation with me. So today, I am expecting a decent number of people. We have 65 on the call already, and typically what happens is a few people will continue to join. But feel free to type a message in the chat box, and to get to the chat box, just move your mouse across the screen, and at the very bottom, probably in the middle, is a button called chat. Click on that and you can type your question in, and I will be alerted to those during the presentation, so that will allow me to pause and spend a little more time on your question. Because one of the things that will happen, we're going to change our screen. I'm going to be sharing mine, and I'll only be able to see a few of you. So I do appreciate those of you that have your faces up. If just look really perplexed if I haven't explained something well. Flag me down as best you can. I can't guarantee who's going to be on the screen with me, but try to get my attention in whatever way we can. But I'm delighted you've taken some time to be with me this morning. I hope you find this to be valuable and a blessing to your congregation. Much of this presentation I have done before. I have done it once by Zoom, just with rostered leaders. It was part of a retreat that they were participating in. So, they probably felt a little obligation to be part of things. You all volunteered to be here, so I'm delighted, and we should be able to have a good time with that. And as we begin, I'd like to lead us in prayer. So let us pray. Dear and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We are grateful for technology that allows us to gather in this fashion. We are grateful for the congregations represented by all of those who have joined this meeting today. Bless our time. May your Spirit guide us as to what we are called to do next. Be with our world, bring peace to our country, bring healing where there is sickness, and bring direction where we need guidance. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Once again, I am recording our session today, so just so you're aware of that. I'm going to move now to screen sharing, so you'll be able to see my screen and a slide presentation. And I always get asked the question, will the slides be made available? Yes, they will. If you want those slides later, you're certainly welcome to get them. Where they will be, and the folks who are part of Stewardship for All Seasons will understand this. They'll be in the Basecamp folders for each synod, the stewardship team, your roster leaders, have access to that folder, and we'll be able to get those slides for you after the presentation today. A recording of this session is also being made, and that will be made available through the Basecamp folder as well. And so for council members unable to join that you think this would be valuable for them, you can make that available to them as well. So excited to be with you today. Some places for additional information beyond what I present today. The Basecamp folder, for those that are in Stewardship for All Seasons, are aware of that and can find videos and more at that spot. My company does a blog. We blog intentionally twice a month, and then we blog additionally as we feel there is need. And we've been doing a lot more additionally lately because of all that's going on in our world. And so if you want to check out what we've got there, you can find our blog at that address. I also was invited, Novus Way, the camps in Region 9, launched a podcast, and I did 6 sessions with them, or actually, for those of you listening at home, I am still in the middle of that. I've recorded the last one now, but the 6 sessions are recorded and are available as a podcast, and you can find that through the website there. Also, for more information, I've written a book. It's called Abundance, Creating a Culture of Generosity. And has many of the topics we'll cover today. And then one other book that I reference a lot in regards to this topic is Governance in Ministry by Dan Hotchkiss. I think this is the go-to book for council leadership in congregations. And so I lift that up for you as well. So for those of you that want more than what I give you today, Those are the places to go for the more that I suggest. There's plenty more out there, just giving you here what I suggest. So as we think about council leadership, I think we need to think about it within the context we're in. And you know, the first question I ask is, what has the crisis shown you? Are we relying on the council to make all of our day-to-day decisions, or is there a clear line between staff and council? I find it critical in times of a pandemic that we have a crisis communication plan. We want to make sure that the message that we want people to hear is the message that's being told. And so was there a crisis communication plan in place so that not everybody is speaking, but that you know, are providing the right messages at the right time to people to keep trust and faith in the organization and to know that the leadership is in charge? I'm curious, with many congregations, has the focus here in these last couple of months since March 15th been more on survival than mission? Or is our mission guiding everything we do? And then what are council leaders doing? Are you calling members and checking on them? Are you exhibiting generosity significant to your means? Are you helping to tell the stories of impact of the ministry during this time? Or is the council kind of absent and not to be found? And probably the thing that I'm most curious about is the budget the only thing that we talk about at our council meetings right now? Is that dominating everything, or is mission dominating everything? We need to be organizations where mission dominates everything and not the budget. And over the last couple of decades, many of our churches have become budget dominated. The budget should be a guide, but a guide for implementing mission, not a limitation and the mission itself. And then now is a great time. Has the council started to ask the question, what has this crisis, this pandemic, shown us that we have opportunity for ministry? I think most of us have found that there might be an opportunity within virtual worship, even beyond the pandemic. I'm not telling you it has to be, but is that something? And if so, then what does it look like? I have a blog on our blog site about this very issue. We did a great job, but we reacted our way into launching virtual worship. I don't want us to react our way into continuing it. We need to have a purpose and a direction behind why we would continue having virtual worship after such a time as all of us are able to gather in person again. We can talk more about that. I think there's going to be a couple other places where that very well may arise for us as we go through this. So you all are all in Stewardship for All Seasons. And so what does this program need from a congregation council? We need you to be leaders. And we need you to begin a mindset that assumes abundance and that you will personally be generous. You know, generous according to your means is something that we often use as a term. And then we need you to cast a vision for new ministry. We need to know, even if we can't fund it all, we need you to cast a vision for what God is calling your congregation to do. And so cast that vision for new ministry. Determine what those new ministry initiatives are. One of my favorite questions to give a council, and I typically save this for the end of the year, but I'm going to actually, those of you that have heard me before know I'm encouraging this even sooner, but for the end of the year, anybody working with me always needs to determine, what would we do with revenue that exceeds expenses? Okay, so if we got into that position at the end of the year that revenue outpaced expenses and we had extra money, what would you do with it? That question is relevant this year and needs to be something we're thinking about. And even more so, I would like for us to start to think in terms of either on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. If we discover that we have extra revenue, what would we do with it? You know, do we have plans internally that we need to expand? Do we have ministry partners externally that we need to support? Because the critical reason for that is we need to continually be giving our donors a reason to continue to give to our ministries. We don't want to just be in a healthy position and tell everybody we don't have any more ministry to do. We want people to always know that God can call us and is calling us to more. And so the worst thing that happens if you tell people what you would do if revenue exceeds expenses, is that you wouldn't have revenue exceed expenses and wouldn't be able to do the ministry. But even then, by telling folks what it is, people start to catch that sense that you have a vision beyond just what the budget tells you can do. We've got a 10-minute video in Basecamp for council members to learn more about Stewardship for All Seasons. And so that's available to you as well, right? So here's our first opportunity to try out Slido. And so for those of you that joined late before you heard me, in the chat box is a website and an event number. And if you can go to if you can open a second browser and go to slido.com and enter that event code, you will then, I just activated a poll that will ask you a question: how effective is your council? And you'll have the chance to rate that 0 to 5, with 5 being best. And I see votes are starting to come in, so at least some of you figured out how to use Slido, so that's great. I'm gonna give it just another second, and then I'm gonna change my screen share and let you all see the results as well. This is what I really like about this tool. So there's 69 people in the meeting, and so far 28 of you have voted. I'm going to give you just another second. Now I'm going to switch over. So now you can see the results. So 33 have rated your councils, and so far and away right now, well, the average score is a 3.8. So 61% of you gave 4 out of 5. A few of you think you're awesome and excellent. That's great. A few of you think maybe some improvement can be made. And I'm confident many of you are just kind of being nice right now this morning. This is just kind of a nice question that I start off with just to kind of get us going. But I'm going to ask the question again at the end and see if perhaps you will rate yourself a little lower, or if you at the end of the workshop think, you know what, we're doing really well. We've got most of this already in place. So so that's why I throw that question out there. So I'm going to switch my screen share back to the slide presentation now. But thanks for going to Slido. I've got a couple more questions that'll come up. So sometimes people say, well, this is a stewardship program that we're enrolled in. Why are we talking about council effectiveness? And I apologize. I tried really hard to get this to look a little bit better on the slide. I'm going to work on that again, but I wanted to start the meeting. So we have something as a firm that we call the 10 steps to success. And these are, we have them for organizations and we have them for congregations, and they're mostly the same, except in a congregation we call it a council instead of a board is probably the number one thing, or actually we sometimes even call it a board, which is the one I picked for this. So step number 1 is to organize the board and staff for effectiveness. And I'll get more into step 1, but then we start the financial development program. Then we start into strategic planning. Then we test that plan, and then we start to live into that plan, which could be expanded ministry or it could be expanded facility. And then ultimately at step 10, we start to get into building an endowment and those sorts of things. Stewardship for All Seasons spends a lot of time on those first 3 steps. We need an effective council. We need to begin that stewardship program, and then we need to get into a strategic ministry vision. And the reason that a council, an organized, effective council is so important for a stewardship program is because if the council is inept, or if the council isn't seen as strong leaders, then people are going to hold back their giving because they won't trust the organization ultimately. And so we need to consistently and continually be building up our council's effectiveness if we're going to be building up our stewardship program. So it's step number 1 for a reason, and it's critical, and it's something that we need to be devoting time to over and over again. So question I love to ask: how many of your council members expect their time on council to be the most fulfilling service they ever give to their congregation? Now, my history is when I lead this workshop in a group setting, there is often a light, uncomfortable chuckle that happens across the room, okay? Because I think many people don't expect that to happen. Many people, talk about, well, I missed a meeting and I got elected to council, right? That's why you go to the annual meeting, is to make sure you don't get elected, right? Or, people think it's a necessary evil. We need that to not be the case. We need for people, when they get nominated for and elected to council, to have the expectation that this is going to be the most fulfilling activity that they ever do for their congregation. Because it should be about casting a vision and seeing the organization begin to live into that vision. It shouldn't be what I experienced as a parish pastor, 4.5 hour meetings that talked about things that weren't very exciting and honestly, many times didn't even need to happen. And we occasionally saw people take their frustration of the day out on some activity that we were doing in council that had nothing to do with what caused their frustration. They were just having a bad day and decided that a few other people got to have a bad day as well. Okay. So we need to set up the idea that if you're on our council, it is going to be the most fulfilling act of service you ever do for this organization. Because any board would hope that that would be the reality for their board members. That if you get elected to a board for a nonprofit, that's going to be your deepest, most satisfying level of service ever to that organization. All right. So why boards exist? These are just a couple of my favorite quotes about it. I'm only going to share the second one. But boards are the ultimate guardians of the institution's ethos and their values. That's Richard Chait in a book called Governance and Leadership. We uphold the mission. We carry the mission of the organization, and we make sure it is being implemented. We don't just make sure that the budget is balanced. We don't just make sure that everybody's happy. We guard the mission and we implement it. And I'll get more into that as we go through. So, but how do you then make this time on council fulfilling? We need to intentionally be developing council members to be leaders. We need to invest in them. I had a president of a college once tell me that about 50% of his time was board development, which I thought was a little too much, except for the fact that in a college board, it tends to be the largest donors are part of the board. And so a lot of that work was actually donor development as much as board development. But he was investing in the lives and the leadership development of the people on his board so that the board could function as well as possible. I once told a council that they met too often, and the pastor pushed back and said, but I need the time for leadership development during the meetings. And if that's the case, then maybe I will agree they weren't meeting too often. But if we're never having one-on-one meetings, if you're the council president or if you're the rostered leader in the organization, if you're not having one-on-one meetings with board members to develop leadership skills, then we shouldn't be expecting people to be growing as leaders. And so we need to put that investment of time. Councils need to focus on the strategic. Too often we focus on the mundane. I will tell you, one of my hobbies is to read council minutes when I visit churches. They're always posted on a bulletin board someplace hard to find, and I look for it. And I find them, and I read the minutes, and I ask myself one simple question. Is this board working towards the advancement of the kingdom of God, or are they spending a lot of time on things that don't matter? The first time I ever did this, I'm not going to tell you which synod this was in or which congregation it was, but the first time I ever did this, I read council minutes. They were 3 pages long, and 1.5 pages was devoted to the discussion on how many poinsettias should be placed around the altar for Advent. a page and a half. Who they should be ordered from, when they should be delivered, how many we should get, who can come and help. It was a whole lot of, I would have come unglued if I had been part of this meeting, because you figure it was probably a 3-hour meeting and a page and a half worth of the minutes was devoted to a topic that shouldn't even have been reported for information purposes to a council. Like that is just something that a worship team should be, or a property team. I don't care who has responsibility for poinsettias. If they're important to you, give the responsibility to somebody and never talk about it again, at least in a council meeting. They should have been empowered to do it. This should not be something that the governing body of a congregation needs to spend time on, let alone half of a meeting. Because there's something also called opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of this was this board was not acting on strategic elements. They were making themselves busy, feeling as if they were doing something when in fact they were doing something that a team should have been free to just go and do. And furthermore, if I had served on this worship and music team, I would have been very frustrated there as well, because what can we actually do until we get permission for everything from the congregation council? That is a great way to keep an organization from growing. You know, imagine an organization that's trying to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, having to go through going back to the board every time they need to make a decision on anything. We would never get one done. What happens is the scientists are told, go to your lab and make it happen. And if you need something, tell a manager and make them get you what you need, like right now. Like you don't have to wait a month or 3 months until we meet again to get what you need. So anyway, focus on strategic, not the tactical level. And then provide a time for a generative discussion. If you've spent a page and a half of minutes space on a conversation on poinsettias, the last thing you want to do in that meeting is have another conversation about anything. But we need to have generative discussions. Like if I were a parish pastor today, the generative discussion I would want to have with my council is, okay, you've engaged virtual worship pretty well while we've had to. How do you see us using virtual worship in the future, right? And leaving it as that open-ended question to engage the folks who are gathered to help you through the idea. And it's a generative discussion isn't one that strives to have an answer that day. A generative discussion is one that says, you're my leaders, help me think through this issue as we move ahead. And that's probably one that we need to have. And I think the time is probably about now to be having that discussion. And then honor people's time. Holy cow. If you can get a meeting done in 45 minutes and have an effective meeting, get it done in 45 minutes. If you need an hour and a half, though, take the hour and a half, but make it useful. Like don't spend time reading a report to somebody who was given a report ahead of time who should have read it ahead of time. Like we need to honor people's time, and I'm going to get to that here in just a couple minutes, how we do that. But honor people's time. Don't take more than you need, but take what you need for effective and important activity. All right. So a question for roster leaders, this is just for you to think about. How many hours per month do you or should you spend developing council leaders? And actually, I should have done this as well for the council presidents. So as a council president, how much time, how many hours a month are you thinking about and spending developing council leaders? And I think if the answer is none, then we need to understand that our councils, we need to stop just trying to get lucky to have an effective council. Like you get lucky if you have the right leader in charge who can lead it well. We need to begin developing leaders. I'll go ahead and insert this here. I believe it all starts even with the devotions that are had during the meeting. And I don't care who does them, but they ought to be done well. When I was in the parish, the words that I most hated to hear, and I heard them far too frequently as a council meeting started, was, oh crap, I have devotions tonight. Which meant we were preparing ourselves then to not have a very effective devotional time. So obviously, spiritual growth and development wasn't a value expressed through the council experience, right? And so if we're trying to develop leaders, I think we are trying to develop spiritual leaders. And so conversation starter or devotions ought to be one of the ways in which we do that. I'll give you a couple ideas for ways I would like to start meetings here in a little while. But why boards exist. I'm a little bit more of a Carver model in why boards exist, but probably not totally. So Carver said that the board will set the policies and then the management implements those policies. So in other words, the board determines what end it is hoping for and then tells management, go and make that happen. And here's where I want to tell you and make sure everybody hears me on this. I think when I look at boards across the nonprofit world, the most difficult one, the most difficult board to have function effectively is the congregation council, okay? The reason for that, my background is outdoor ministry. Many of you know I was VP of advancement at Novus Way for 12 years. The board was in charge of the ends. They told us as management what they wanted us to do, and then we just hired enough people to get it done. In the congregation, we don't have that luxury. Most congregations are too small to hire out every position and every management activity that needs to get done. And so what happens in the congregational setting is sometimes management is a paid staff person, but then sometimes management is a lay member of the congregation who also sits on the board. And so that person has such a difficult task of determining when it is they're a board member and then when it is that they transition and become management. And so I hope that makes sense, and you'll see how that makes sense here as we move into how we divide things up. But if we work from a strategic plan, the council, the board, focuses on vision and mission, and then shared with staff works on strategic priorities. And then staff and teams work on goals and operations, okay? So there's that, the board is responsible for casting the vision and knowing the mission and holding us to that. Together, the strategic priorities are developed, and then staff gets to implement those. And again, sometimes staff is volunteer staff, which might even be a board member heading up the worship committee, okay? But if we can keep this transition between these clear, then we won't have council meetings talking about how many poinsettias should we have on the altar during Advent, okay? Because that's an operations issue, right? That's something that staff and a team should be able to implement. And we're terrible, even worse is property issues. We think that every property issue has to be completely vetted by a council. No, it doesn't. Property issues should be handled by the property team. What the council needs to do is work on developing enough resources so that our facilities can be cared for. And if we're always having financial issues about the facility, then working on a planned giving program so that we can build an endowment large enough to care for our facilities so that the property team can replace the air conditioning when it needs to, can fix a hole in a roof without asking somebody's permission, and can care for the ongoing operations of our facilities. That's the issue, but too often we talk about the holes in the roof and getting 3 bids. Holy cow, I'm so sick of hearing 3 bids. That's a great operational issue for a property team to do and before they operate. But councils don't need to spend all this time figuring out which bid they like best, okay? That's a management activity that should be delegated to a property team. If your issue happens to be lack of resources, then focus on a planned giving program, focus on developing your annual fund. And I applaud all of you. You're in the Stewardship for All Seasons program, which is certainly a strong step, in my opinion, in helping with that. So if the council focuses on mission, vision, and strategic priorities, people will be much more fulfilled by their time of service on council. When we get into the mundane day-to-day activities, when we're doing management's job, that's where we get frustrated, all right? So how do you be a board member? You have a duty of care. You're informed, you leave your personal agenda behind, and you attend regularly. This is the most important. If staff reports are important to you as an organization, They should be sent out ahead of time. They should be read ahead of time, and that's all that needs to happen, because you have a duty of care. So of course you read things, right? If you have a bad day of work, you don't care about that. I mean, well, you do care about that, but you leave that behind as you have your meeting, and you show up, right? If you're on a board, you should show up. I think we should have policies in place that if you miss a certain number of meetings, you have to resign from the board, because obviously it's not a priority. At the same time, I think our boards should make opportunities available, even when we can meet face-to-face, to still have virtual engagement, so that people like me who used to travel a lot could still serve on the board even if I'm not in town. So we've got to honor that there is some technology that doesn't require driving to church, sitting down for a meeting, having a meeting, driving home. Anyway, a duty of loyalty means you act in a manner that doesn't harm the organization. You make good decisions for it. And your duty of obedience is obedience to the mission. What you implement falls in line with the purpose of the organization and doesn't, go outside of that. So those three duties are critically important. All right, let's do another Slido poll. And this is just a fill in the blank. Who does the council represent? All right. Oh, I need to open. You can't answer yet because I haven't made it available to you. Sorry. I think maybe I have to stop sharing. Give me a sec. Sorry, it signed me out of Slido for some reason. Okay, it is now open. So the question is, who does the council represent? And this is just a fill in the blank answer. Answers are starting to come in. We have 34 answers in. So as I'm looking through, there's kind of a blend between people saying the congregation, the entire church body, the members of the congregation, and then there's another group who talk about the mission. And then there's others who talk about God and God's mission, the gospel's mission, God. Rubber stamp, I would hope not. Rubber stamp types of boards are the ones that lead you to not be very fulfilled by serving on them, and we need to change that idea. So there's a blend. This one doesn't score because I left it open, because if I had made it multiple choice, you would have known what I thought the right answer was, I'm convinced. In my opinion, the right answer, and also in Dan Hodgkiss's opinion, the right answer is the mission. Sorry, I'm trying to talk and manipulate my computer at the same time, and I'm obviously not skilled enough to do that. So Hodgkiss is very clear, and this was maybe an aha moment for me. The council represents the mission. That's what we're set to support. I used to think that we were responsible to represent the congregation, and not like if I'm a choir member that I represent the choir, or if I'm on the finance committee, I represent the finance committee. But what Hotchkiss says, and again, I love his book, Governance and Ministry. I think it's a great read for those of you that really want to dig into council leadership type things. But he really articulates that the council is, you're not there to represent anybody currently in the congregation. You're there to represent the mission, which is the congregation living out why it exists as a nonprofit entity into the future, okay? Now, those of you that put the gospel and God, if we've got our mission statement right, you all were correct as well, okay? Because our mission should reflect the gospel, should reflect what God is calling the organization to do as it moves into the future, okay? So we can certainly talk more about that as we need to, but I believe the council represents the mission, not necessarily the members of the congregation. Now, we certainly don't want to cause tension and conflict, but sometimes we may cause some conflict in the congregation for the sake of the mission, that the long-term future of the organization depends on us making this decision and moving ahead with this. So 4 things that councils ought to do is, the first thing is to set a clear mission so that we know exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish and who we are as an organization. And that gets reflected in a mission statement. And I think it's fine for the council to dust off and review that mission statement on an annual basis to make sure it's right. If you do more than just minor tweaks to that mission statement, though, you probably need to be careful. Are you really listening to God as to what the organization is called to do, or not? But then you carry that mission. So, I used to, in my cynical moments, I would say that, as long as a mission statement didn't do any harm, it was okay. And I was wrong to think that. Our mission statements matter. What the problem is, too often, they just say some churchy things that we think we're supposed to say in our mission statement, and they could reflect any church. We need to make sure that our mission statement reflects who we are as our representation of the body of Christ and living that out. And then we need to set some SMART goals. SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-specific goals. And we probably need to set like 3 of them, okay? I had a congregation share with me their previous goals, and they had, I think, 39 of them, all right? And when they handed them to me, they also said something like, and we haven't really accomplished much of this. Well, of course you haven't. You were trying to do 39 different things. Over the next 3 years, if your congregation set and achieved 3 goals, I would say well done, okay? Now, each goal might have some objectives and it might have a bunch of tactics, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But I think 3 goals would be just delightful. And then measure your success and failure. Find out how you're doing. And the reason I like to measure is because so much of ministry is not tangible, that when we can measure progress towards something, and it is possible to measure things that we often don't think are tangible. Like if we're trying to develop more community, one of the ways we can measure that, and I know it's hard to do right now, is we're not gathering in person, but one of the ways to measure the development of community is how long do people linger after a worship service? And just set a stopwatch on it to see how long are people staying to linger after a worship service. That is a way to measure how much people are engaging each other, interacting with one another. It's what a retailer would do. Walmart knows how many minutes the average customer stays in the store, and their goal is to increase that number. They want to sell something. If we want to develop community, we can look at those same things. And so we need to measure what we care about. I'll get to that again in a few minutes. So some best practices for councils. Oftentimes, people's favorite thing that I talk about in this entire worship is the first bullet on this. All right? So the councils who are being most effective and that are honoring people's time the most are those that have what's called a consent agenda. A consent agenda is for those things that really don't need to be discussed, but they do need to be approved, like membership transfers, okay? Constitutionally, you need to approve people to either come into the congregation or to be removed from the roster. it doesn't really, if somebody moved, do we really need to talk about that and spend valuable time in a meeting to discuss whether or not we should release the Smith family because they moved to West Virginia? So put stuff like that into a consent agenda. You can put reports in there. You can put all the things that really don't need discussion into what's called a consent agenda, and then vote in that en bloc. So you vote on all of those things at once, so that your minutes don't need to reflect that you had 32 motions this week. No, all of this goes into one, and you simply approve it. People read it ahead of time. Now, with a consent agenda, if anybody objects to something being in there and wants to talk about it, they have a moment in the council meeting where they can pull it from the consent agenda so that it will be discussed and it will be on the table differently, okay? This can save you tons of time, because oftentimes, I recently read a congregation's minutes, and every committee had to say something, at least according to their minutes. Well, they actually don't. The people that serve on your councils can read, and those reports are sent out ahead of time. Let them read the reports and then just accept all the reports in consent, okay? You can take 30 minutes, well, actually you can take a lot longer than that, just by having everybody feel like they have to talk and say something at the meeting. That's not the best use of time. So that's a consent agenda. Read your minutes and see, do our minutes reflect a ministry that's advancing the kingdom of God? I think that's one of the best questions you can ask yourself. And if not, figure out how you can change your practices so that they do. The question about how frequently councils should meet, we're one of the few boards in America that meet monthly typically, okay? Oftentimes what happens when you meet monthly, you start talking about things that really aren't your business, okay? That's when the board starts to get into management's work, all right? I think you should meet as frequently as you have a purpose, all right? If you cannot establish a purpose for a meeting, cancel the meeting, all right? Or work on your strategic plan, because if your strategic plan is robust enough, you can probably find a purpose for your meeting to help your strategic plan along. But again, I'm not here to tell you should meet monthly or you should meet quarterly or what you should do, but meet as often as you have a purpose, all right? And think through that purpose. The goal isn't to not have a meeting. The goal is to lead an organization to effectiveness and health and vitality, okay? That's what the goal is. The goal isn't shorter meetings. The goal isn't no meetings. The goal is to lead an organization to effectiveness and vitality. All your board members need to know what the core values of the organization are and what the mission is. The primary focus, too, of the council is to look at the strategic initiatives and how are they coming to fruition. And when you recruit council members, recruit them for the gifts they bring. I was once nominated for and elected to a board because I have a fundraising background, and this organization was getting ready to enter into a capital campaign, which I thought was a decent reason to invite me onto a board. But then they didn't let me talk about the campaign. It kind of felt like a bait and switch activity. Here's the gift you have that we'd like you on the board for, but we're not going to let you serve on the campaign team. It kind of made no sense to me. So elect people for the gifts they have, and then use those gifts for why you elected them. And then after every board meeting, I would ask these questions. Did you have a purpose? Was it articulated? Did you fulfill it? Were people prepared? So I was on the National Church Council for the ELCA. We would do this. We would only meet twice a year. But after every plenary, which was kind of the equivalent of a council meeting for a congregation, after every plenary time, we would evaluate it. And if council members had obviously not read their material ahead of time, they were called out for it. Actually, even worse is council members being called out for being on Facebook instead of engaging in the meeting, which put a quick end to those activities. People came prepared because they wanted to not get called out, but because it honored everybody's time to be prepared. And so after every board meeting, if somebody obviously hadn't read a memo and went on a tangent, they need to be called out for not being prepared for the meeting. Did council members learn of or share ways that God is active in the world? This is the way I would actually start every council meeting. Instead of with devotions, I would start the council meeting asking people, how have you seen God active and alive through the ministry of our church in the last month? And share those stories so that council members then have a story to tell that they can share with other members. And then actually I would deploy people in the midst of the meeting to go call 2 families and let them know what God's been up to. That's how I would start every council meeting if I were in charge. And then how are we sharing those stories with members? Did we focus on the strategic or did we focus on the minutia? And if you evaluate that every time, your council meetings will begin to transform and change and be more effective, okay? Here's the model council agenda in my opinion, all right? Devotions, consent agenda. Consider any items that were removed from consent. Approve the consent agenda. Strategic plan update. A generative discussion. Generative discussions are those that you're not having it to come to an answer. You're having it to have people help you understand a topic better. And then items for new business with a preliminary discussion, and then old business. Hotchkiss makes a case that nothing should ever be brought to a council at a meeting and voted on at that meeting, okay? Until you've given it discernment time, you shouldn't vote on it. And it's also where people, it's personal behavior. There are people out there that the first time they hear something, they want to vote against it. It's just kind of how they're put together. So you bring it up in new business to have a conversation about it, but not to vote on it at that time, just to get the discussion out and to learn what other facts, figures, and basis for this do we need to have before the next meeting so that we can vote in favor of it next meeting. Because the goal is to be bringing things in front that can then move the organization ahead. The goal is not to stifle the organization. At the same time, the council's job is to lead and make sure you don't go down the wrong paths. And so we need to give people the tools and the way that we can best do that. So bringing something up the first time to talk about it, but not to answer the question, and then bring it to old business with any other detail and activity that we need is a great way to go into the future. So go back to your congregation council, look at your minutes. Where do they reflect people growing in faith or learning about a ministry outcome? What did you devote an hour and a half to that really didn't even need any time? I'm not going to show them to you today, but I've taken a council, I've taken their minutes, and they only did 3 things that actually needed to be done. They called the meeting to order. They nominated people for officer positions, and they adjourned. Everything else that took place in the meeting didn't actually need to happen, okay? So take a look and see, what are you devoting way too much time to? Are you focused on mission and vision, or are you focused on tactics, okay? And then start looking at how you can do better. And this is a culture change, and this is going to take time. You're not going to get all of a sudden to be in the perfect place, but it can evolve over time, certainly. All right, next Slido question for you. What is the ideal size of a congregation council? And I believe that the poll is now open. I didn't get knocked out this time. I'm going to switch my screen share. All right, with 36 votes in, 7 to 8 people is garnering the most votes, not to sway anybody's vote at this point. Nobody said 14 or more. Good. Good answer. So we're still about 50, close to 50% saying 7 to 8 people, followed closely behind with 9 to 11. And then a few people thought even smaller, a few people thought a little bit larger than that. I'm not here to tell you what size your council ought to be. Dan Hotchkiss, whose book and whose leadership skills in this area I highly respect, he says 7, which is what most of you voted for, about half of you voted for. He thinks 7 is the ideal number. Reasons he thinks that are a number of them. First, he says it's an odd number, which means that there's always a majority answer, okay? 7, he says, is small enough that people don't skip meetings because you will be noticed if you miss. 7 is also small enough to recognize in most congregations, you're not there to represent the choir or the youth committee or whoever your group of people is, because you don't have somebody there representing every team, right? One of the models that we had back in the 80s and 90s was that for everybody on council to then be a liaison to a team. And that's really where we developed this idea that I represent the youth committee or I represent the finance committee on council. Well, no, you're a board member. You represent the mission and implement that. So, and the other reason for 7 is the discussion. You can't hide and not have anything to say. That everybody's opinion around the table will be valued and is valuable. And so that's where he is. And there's a question in the chat bar, does the 7 or 8 include the pastor or not? It would include the pastor if the pastor's a voting member according to your documents, which I think the pastor should be a voting member of the council. So, but again, I'm not here to be rigid to say it has to be 7. For those reasons I just shared is what Hotchkiss says, 7 is a good number. You may find that 9 is a great number for you, or you may find that 5 is a wonderful number for you. All right. But Hotchkiss would say 7. I think for most congregations, 7 is really a pretty good number. All right. And a quick conversation about committees and teams. So when I got ordained back in '97, the big deal conversation was, transitioning from committees to teams. And what we did is we changed the names of our committees to call them teams, and nothing else changed. Okay, it was quite bizarre, but rostered leaders would go to gatherings and they would argue about whether they had committees or teams. And if you had committees, you were old school and not relevant, but the teams looked just like committee, but it had a different name. Hotchkiss would say there should be 4 standing committees and there should only be 4 committees: finance, nominating, personnel, and governance. Governance looks at the Constitution. Governance probably does your new board member orientation. Personnel, that's self-explanatory. Nominating is a nominating committee, finance committee. Finance committee really should be looking at long-term finance more so than the short-term. I'm probably not going to get most of you to change that, so I'm not going to go too far down that road. But the finance committee should really be looking at 2- and 3-year budgets more than they should be looking so much at how much money did we spend last week. Management really should be monitoring that, but a finance committee can do that too. I'm not going to fall on that sword. And then teams are who implements the ministry, okay? And so everything else would be a team. Here's the difference. A committee reports to the board. A team reports to management. And every congregation has to define who management is. In many of our congregations, it's going to be the senior pastor. I'm not here to tell you who it needs to be in your place. But a team would fall to senior pastor, or in some cases, there was a church out in Austin, Texas, did a great job with a church administrator, which is where all the teams reported. So the pastor could be pastor, but the administrator kept everything moving. But the teams were the ministry implementation. The committees were really the organizational, making sure it was functioning from a governance standpoint. With teams, limiting something to the education team is a little limiting, because if you really want to launch Vacation Bible School and you haven't had Vacation Bible School and the education team doesn't want to do Bible school, you can't launch Bible school. So oftentimes we don't like to put the word "the" on front of a committee, because it will end up limiting it too much, that may be something you worry about later. But we want to have nimbleness, that a new team can be created to launch a ministry that we are called to launch. Like, we don't want to have the digital communications team, because everything digital would have to go through that team. And if they don't want to start doing podcasts, then, you get limited. So anyway, that's enough on that. Couple of real life examples just to share with you about some of the ways in which we don't always do things the right way. A council was spending far too much time, and they were stuck on an $800 issue. This is a congregation that had about a $550,000 budget. All right. A council with a $550,000 budget should not be spending a lot of time on an $800 issue. And they were going to freeze good ministry over $800. Finally, somebody on council just said, here's $100. Can you all join me, give a little more money, and we just make this happen? That's an example of, instead of getting bogged down, being led through a stifling issue. This was an actual motion in a real live congregation. Like, this was published on a website somewhere. A motion was made to put the front pews back into the church. 5 approved, 4 objected, and 4 abstained. The motion did carry. First off, I am delighted I don't serve this congregation. All right. Especially a vote that came in 5-4 with 4 abstentions. And why is the council talking about whether or not pews should be put back into a sanctuary setting? That's either a worship and music team decision or a property team decision. Why are our teams not empowered to make the decisions they need to make? This front pews back in a sanctuary, I don't believe to be a strategic decision. Okay, this is I would have quit this council if I served on it, or I would have asked to become chair so I could make sure that stuff like this didn't come before the council. One of the two would have happened. So I had a congregation that, as it was developing its core values, told me that service was one of its core values. But then if you looked at its budget, there was no service anywhere to be found in the budget. And if Jesus is right that where your treasure is, your heart will be, they weren't living out their core values. And that means they weren't living out their mission. And so leadership needs to do that audit. It's an audit I do, but it's a leadership audit that needs to look and say, hey, folks, we claim that service is our core value, but we're not investing any money into it. I'm not sure I can believe that we're being honest with ourselves. And then one more, congregation couldn't figure out why they were shrinking. But then if you looked at their goals, they had no goal to grow. Okay, sitting around and saying, boy, I wish we would grow again isn't going to help you grow. We will grow if we want to grow. We will grow by having a goal to do so, and then by implementing objectives and tactics that foster growth. Okay, growth in the world today doesn't just happen for the sake of happening, except in a few instances where we get lucky. And so, as a leadership body, if you want your organization to grow, don't just say that. Don't just tell management that they should grow. Develop the strategic priority to grow. Work with management then to determine the goals and then the objectives and tactics that will foster that growth. And then make sure you provide the resources in order for it to happen. That's the council's job. Just calling the right pastor to make growth happen isn't going to do it. If you want to grow, set a goal for it. If you want your people more engaged, set a goal for it. If you want your property cared for adequately, I hope your strategy is beyond that, but set a goal for it. That's the way we need to operate. Finally, I love it when a council will create a dashboard and track things. And I don't care what you track, except to say, track what's important to you, okay? If attendance numbers are really important to you, track them. I know of a congregation that had 2 campuses. One of the campuses was declining in attendance. Well, they didn't know that until they looked at the attendance records to see that. Then they evaluated, why would the second campus be declining? Well, the reason is nobody on staff was responsible for the second campus. Nobody had offices there. It was just kind of something that they went to periodically. And so when they invested back into it, it started to grow again. That was something that they cared about. Revenue, we tend to track pretty well. Sometimes we don't track it well. We sometimes tell people we're behind on giving, when in fact everybody that's still alive at the congregation is ahead on their giving. It's just that somebody who was really generous died the year before and isn't giving anymore. So let's be careful the way we present things. But if you want more people to come to your church, track your first-time visitors. Track what is important to you, and then look at it, and then figure out what you should do about it when the trends aren't what you're looking for. So, all right, where are we? 12:04. I finished about a minute sooner than I expected to. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and invite you all now. Use the chat box to ask questions, or if you'd like to, you can unmute yourself and ask me to clarify or share more about something. Let me know. Either way is fine with me. Chat box seems to work well with a group this size, but if you want to unmute and ask a question, you're certainly welcome to. And I know there's got to be some questions because I just dumped a whole lot of stuff at you.
Mike, I would like to get some feedback from you and maybe from some other churches, how their stewardship has gone for this first several months of the year, especially since March. Mm-hmm. Has anybody noticed any downward trends in giving?
I would say the majority of folks that are working with me are still seeing very positive signs. There are certainly some people who have not given in that period, and hopefully we've begun to identify who they are and start to work through that. But overall, church people who are still employed have remained at least steady, with many even giving extra. There are certainly anomalies depending upon, and you've got people in the Carolinas and Wisconsin and Michigan, that have been affected differently by this pandemic on the call today. So it depends. I mean, if the neighborhood's been drastically affected, it's going to be a more significant impact. But what I'm still seeing is still a very strong giving level within our congregations.
And as we track those who committed, mm-hmm. and those who have met their commitment as they had planned by their intent card, by their pledge. For those we know who have not, would that be? Would you recommend that we reach out to them to especially check on them to see how they're doing during this pandemic? Hopefully get to a conversation around their giving intentions?
Yeah, I would make sure that the first contact people get isn't a contact saying, "Can you catch up on your giving?"
Right.
I've been encouraging council members to do just what I call care calls, where they're checking in with the members and kind of going on a rotation with that to find out how people are doing, and at least leaving a message. I am finding one of the things I hate to say it this way, enjoyed most about this time is that people answer their phone now. I'm actually getting a lot more people to pick up and answer, and great responses to that. So certainly, I think council members, if you haven't done this, set up a system that you get some phoning done to every member of the congregation first. Then begin to identify who hasn't given. Sometimes the people who haven't given, I'm not yet ready to blame them, right? They simply haven't liked the tactics that we've presented them yet, right? And so I think a lot of the people that haven't given yet are the people who like to drop a check in the plate when they worship in person, and we're not doing that. And so have we mailed a letter to their home that has a return envelope for them to write the check and send it in? I talked to a congregation last week that the leader had 6 checks from the same individual. That week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6, that they wrote them all and mailed them all in one package. So before I'm ready to blame the donor, I want to make sure that our tactics have caught up to the way in which they want to give. Just because I think text to give might be really cool, and we've got this great app for it, doesn't mean all of our donors are going to flock to it and use it. So some of that we need to be developing to them. And then I want to strategize towards those people who haven't given yet to see what we can do to help catch them up. And I want to do that now before summer gets too far and they get too far behind. Anyway, I think giving is still strong. I don't think the church is experiencing a slump yet. There tends to be a surge in initial levels of giving. And the more we continue to tell stories of generosity around us, and the more we tell ministry impact, like what it means to have virtual worship, what it means to have Bible study online, what it means in this time to still be able to have church activity going on, we need to make sure that we're telling some of those stories. So,
okay. Can you go back and revisit the topic that I think you mentioned, that when we go back to in-person in our sanctuaries, to face-to-face worship, that the importance of online or discontinuing online?
Well, so there's going to be phases. Like we at some point will get back to some face-to-face worship, but not everybody's coming back. Like, you know, there are people that until there's a vaccine, they're not coming back, right? And so there's going to be an interim place where we're going to be in person, and we're going to have people that we love and care for who aren't going to be there. So we need to know what we're going to do then. But then let's pretend we're 18 months. The discussion I want you to have is pretend we're 18 months from now. There's a vaccine, and everybody who wants to attend worship in person is able to do so. What then is the purpose of our virtual service? Is it that we've discovered our homebound members really love the chance to be worshiping again? If that's the case, then a live stream is probably fine. But if we found that we have a message that our community is kind of checking us out, well, an hour and 10-minute service live streamed is probably not what a person checking you out wants to engage. That's just my opinion. You all can have your own opinion. This is why you all need to have a generative discussion on this. I think if you're wanting, or, you know, as travel volleyball starts back up, do we want to have a service available for people who traveled this weekend to be able to engage worship with us? If you're trying to reach busy people, your hour and 10-minute live stream is probably not the way to do so. And so you all need to have a discussion on what's the long-term purpose of virtual? Like, and I'm not here to answer it for you. I hope it's different for all of you, but it needs to fit your context. But just saying, hey, we used to do that during the pandemic, we should continue, that's just busyness, okay? And we don't want to just make people busier. And so if we're going to continue it, we need to identify who's the audience, why are we doing this, and what's the goal we hope for? Like, is the goal that 1,000 people a week engage your worship between in-person and virtual? I just made that up. I don't know if that's achievable or not. That's kind of something for you there. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to go through a couple of these questions in the chat box. Do I have a suggestion on a dashboard? I do, but I can't remember what it is. I will try and get that posted to Basecamp for you. It's an excellent question. There are plenty of apps out there that'll do that for you. All of them, of course, are dependent upon data in causes your data out to matter. So, yes, yeah, I have many congregations that are up in giving, and then those that got PPP loans are definitely up in giving. So far, the most I've heard of any congregation needing of a PPP loan in a worst case projection is about 25% of the money, which means they'll still be up by the end of the year. Please, I hope you've just discerned what it is you'll do with that extra money at the end of the year, because I don't think it's ethical to keep it, because that was a gift from the government to keep people employed and to do stuff with. It wasn't given for us to build our reserves. Those of you working with me will get more of that as we continue to journey together. The Google Docs can be a way. There's other apps out there that can help you. Suggested resources for engaging in strategic planning. That is something to get into. As part of SAS, we will do a unit on strategic planning, and I am finding many congregations are really eager for this. So any of you that are really wanting to get further into strategic planning, you can reach out to me before that session comes up in the Stewardship for All Seasons time, and I will reach out to the person that asked the question. It was a private question. So can I propose best practices to transition from ministry team leaders and how to transition all of this? Yes. Read this book together. Engage the council in a book study to get into this. Don't just say, hey, we listened to this guy and he said we should only have 7 on our council and that none of you should represent a team, so we're going to get rid of half of you and just go down to 7 people. Those of you that are in the stewardship program with me directly know that you can blame me for anything you need to, but that's probably pushing it a little bit. It will take a discernment period to transition here. Many of you will have to even change your constitutional documents, getting Senate approval and back and forth with some of that as well. Let this be a process. Like consent agenda can start at your next meeting. Transitioning from a council of 14 to a council of 7, that needs some discernment. That needs more people involved and engaged. I think do a book study on that. I've got a little bit of it in my book, which is an easier read than Hotchkiss's book. But at the same time, I think if this is something you really want to dig into, either establish a governance committee to begin looking at this or do this study together as a council. I'm a big fan of book studies as a council. And I think that's probably one of the ways. Blame me for whatever you want to, but I do think you need to take a little time. And remember, the reason to go from 14 to 7 isn't so that it's easier to recruit people. All right, I never said that. And I recorded this session. I can go back to that and prove it. It's so that you can be focused on the things you need to be focused on. So that's going to take a little time. I would be surprised if most of you go that route in under 2 years, probably. It's okay to, it's okay to take a little time. So how is a new leader prepared if roles are limited to 2 years? The governance committee is incredibly important. The governance committee makes sure that people not only get nominated and elected, but they get trained before their first meeting so that it doesn't take them 3 minutes to catch up to what's going on. You've got to train your new board members so that they hit the ground running and they're ready to make decisions and they understand where the congregation is in its history. And that's the best way to overcome that. Because 2 years, even 3 years isn't that long in board governance. And so you've got to put that energy into that training in order to keep people going. Yeah, constitution, communicating to the congregation, working through the changes with the current council. Again, I think a book study is a great way to go. And then keeping the congregation informed along the way. Like, let people know that you're reading this book together. Let people know some of the things that you've begun to transition. Let people know, holy cow, we went to a consent agenda and all of a sudden our council now has time to talk about the future. And here's what we talked about last month. Let people know this along the way so that they sense and see you becoming more effective. And then when you want to change something, it doesn't feel like a threat because they see you becoming more effective. At my blog site, there is a video on communication to give you some more things there. Meredith, contact me about purchasing my book. I've gone through the chat box. We're an hour and 15 minutes in, which is a long time for a Zoom meeting. Any other questions we need to get to before the people on the East Coast start going and having lunch? My book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Fortress Press. If you want bulk, contact me directly, and I can work with you on that. So I think I'm going to call us an hour and 18 minutes really is a long time for a Zoom meeting. And it's been a lot of me talking. But I really appreciate your engagement for the topic.